Hannibal Barca crossed the Alps in 218 BC, and the Roman Republic did not just lose battles. It lost its ability to predict the war. An army with elephants and cavalry appeared where Roman doctrine said it could not appear, then went on to shatter Roman forces at Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and Cannae. And yet the campaign ends in a way that feels wrong. Hannibal wins the kind of victories that should end a war, but the war does not end. Why would a commander choose a route designed to destroy his own army before the first decisive engagement? What assumption about Roman decision-making was he betting everything on? And if that assumption was even slightly false, would the entire campaign have collapsed on the mountainside? The core strategic problem of this campaign is not how Hannibal crossed the Alps. That question is technical, and history has already obsessed over it. The real problem is why Hannibal believed crossing the Alps was the least bad option available to him. By 218 BC, Carthage could not win a conventional war against Rome. Roman naval dominance made a direct invasion by sea nearly suicidal. A slow advance through familiar land routes would give Rome time to concentrate forces, choose battlefields, and grind Hannibal down through superior manpower. Every orthodox option led to the same outcome: a war of attrition Hannibal could not afford. So the strategic question becomes sharper and more uncomfortable. If every reasonable option leads to defeat, is the irrational choice actually the only rational one? This is why the Alpine crossing matters. Not as an act of courage or endurance, but as a deliberate rejection of Roman expectations. Hannibal was not trying to surprise Roman soldiers. He was trying to ambush Roman decision-making. He was betting that Rome's strategic system would collapse under an outcome it had categorized as impossible. But this raises a more dangerous implication. A strategy built on shock only works once. And once the shock fades, what remains is an army deep in enemy territory, bleeding men, dependent on fragile alliances, and locked into a campaign with no clear end state. To understand whether this was genius or self-inflicted entrapment, we first need to understand the situation Hannibal was actually facing before he ever reached the mountains. Before Hannibal ever touched the Alps, the war was already asymmetrical in ways that favored Rome. Rome controlled the sea. Not partially. Systemically. Its navy did not need to win a decisive naval battle to matter. Its mere presence denied Carthage the ability to move large forces safely across the Mediterranean. Any attempt to land an invasion force in Italy by sea would have been detected, shadowed, and intercepted long before it could assemble combat power. Naval superiority meant Rome chose when and where wars escalated. On land, the imbalance was even more structural. Rome could replace losses at a rate Carthage could not match. Roman manpower was not just larger. It was politically organized for endurance. Citizen levies, allied contingents, and a command system built for rotation meant Rome could absorb defeat without strategic collapse. Losing an army was catastrophic for most states. For Rome, it was painful but survivable. Hannibal understood this. He was not facing a single Roman army. He was facing a war-making system. From Spain, Hannibal had three theoretical options. He could wait and defend Carthaginian holdings, allowing Rome to dictate the tempo. He could attempt a maritime invasion, risking annihilation at sea. Or he could carry the war into Italy itself, before Rome could fully mobilize. Only one of these options shifted the strategic burden onto Rome. But even that option came with constraints that bordered on the absurd. Italy was not friendly territory. The Italian peninsula was a lattice of Roman allies, bound by treaties, hostages, and long-standing fear of Roman retribution. Hannibal's hope was not conquest by force. It was political fracture. He needed Rome's allies to defect, or at least hesitate. Without that, every battle won would simply be replaced by another Roman army. This is where geography becomes strategic, not scenic. The Alps were not just mountains. They were a filter. Any army crossing them would arrive exhausted, under strength, and logistically exposed. Conventional wisdom treated this as a reason not to cross. Hannibal treated it as a screen. An army that survived the Alps would not be large enough to threaten Rome directly, but it would be just large enough to destabilize Roman assumptions. Roman intelligence, such as it was, operated on probabilities. Large forces move slowly. They require roads, supply lines, and ports. Armies do not appear suddenly where no roads exist. These were not foolish assumptions. They were statistically correct. And Hannibal planned to exploit that statistical confidence. Time pressure compounded everything. Rome had already declared war. Delay favored Rome. Every month Hannibal remained in Spain, Roman commanders could plan, coordinate, and choose favorable theaters. Speed was not a preference. It was a requirement. The Alps offered the fastest route into northern Italy precisely because they were assumed to be unusable. But this strategic picture also hides a deeper vulnerability. Hannibal's entire campaign depended on reactions he did not control. Roman allies needed to defect. Gallic tribes needed to cooperate. Roman commanders needed to make predictable decisions under stress. None of these were guaranteed. In fact, each introduced a separate failure point. If the Gauls resisted, Hannibal would bleed men before reaching Roman territory. If Roman allies stayed loyal, Hannibal would be isolated. If Rome refused decisive battle, Hannibal would be stranded. So why take this risk? Because Rome's greatest strength was also its rigidity. Roman command culture prized consistency, repetition, and doctrinal continuity. This worked when Rome controlled the pace. It became dangerous when Rome faced novelty. Hannibal's map of the war was not about terrain alone. It was about expectations layered onto terrain. He was not trying to beat Roman legions in the abstract. He was trying to force Roman leaders into choices they were psychologically unprepared to make. And that brings us to the uncomfortable question at the center of this campaign. What did Roman military doctrine actually prescribe in this situation? And why would following it lead directly into Hannibal's trap? Roman military doctrine was not foolish. It was optimized. It was built to solve a specific problem: how to defeat peer enemies through reliability, discipline, and repetition. Roman commanders were trained to avoid uncertainty, minimize exposure, and bring the enemy to battle on terms Rome could sustain. Under normal conditions, this doctrine worked. If an enemy entered Italy, Roman logic dictated 3 immediate responses. Contain the threat. Protect allied cities. Assemble overwhelming force. Delay if necessary. Avoid rash engagement. Let manpower and logistics do the work. This approach assumed something crucial: that the enemy's entry point would be legible. Armies come by sea or by road. They arrive near supply hubs. They announce themselves through preparation. Doctrine depends on predictability not because generals are unimaginative, but because systems function by filtering noise from signal. Hannibal shattered that filter. By crossing the Alps, he did not just bypass Roman defenses. He invalidated the categories Roman planners used to assess threat. An army that should not exist could not be properly measured. Roman commanders knew something was wrong, but they could not immediately agree on what kind of wrong it was. This uncertainty produced a doctrinal contradiction. Roman logic said, do not give battle to an invader until full strength is assembled. Roman politics said, an enemy on Italian soil cannot be allowed to roam freely. The result was a series of compromises. Roman commanders engaged piecemeal. They sought containment without full coordination. They underestimated the psychological impact of novelty. A normal general, facing Hannibal's options in Spain, would never choose the Alps. Not because it was dangerous, but because it destroyed optionality. Once committed, there was no retreat. No resupply by sea. No reinforcement pipeline. No margin for error. Doctrine teaches preservation of force for a reason. Hannibal deliberately violated that principle. Why? Because doctrine also teaches the enemy how to respond. Hannibal understood that Roman commanders would interpret his presence in Italy through existing frameworks. They would assume desperation. They would assume exhaustion. They would assume he could be managed like any other invading force. And that assumption created a fatal asymmetry. Roman doctrine optimized for wars of attrition and recovery. Hannibal optimized for wars of decision and shock. This is the deeper break from orthodoxy. The Alpine crossing was not meant to win the war by itself. It was meant to force Rome into decisive engagement before Rome was strategically ready to absorb the consequences of losing. Yet this introduces a disturbing paradox. If Rome refused decisive battle, Hannibal's strategy collapsed. If Rome sought decisive battle too quickly, Rome risked catastrophic defeat. Hannibal's campaign was therefore not a military puzzle. It was a psychological squeeze applied to a political military system under stress. Which raises the next question. How does a decision this extreme actually come into existence? Who proposed it, who resisted it, and what assumptions allowed it to survive internal opposition? Decisions like this do not emerge fully formed. They survive argument, resistance, and fear before they ever face the enemy. Within the Carthaginian command structure, the Alpine crossing was not an obvious choice. It was a proposal that violated basic assumptions about force preservation and command responsibility. Losing half an army before meeting the enemy was not bold. It was, by conventional standards, reckless. Hannibal's authority mattered here. He was not just a field commander. He was the inheritor of a military lineage shaped by loss. His father, Hamilcar Barca, had fought Rome to exhaustion and watched Carthage bleed without resolution. That memory framed every strategic conversation. Hannibal was not searching for victory in battle. He was searching for a way to end a war Rome was designed to prolong. Opposition inside his camp focused on logistics and survivability. Supply lines would collapse. Allied tribes might turn hostile. Elephants were liabilities, not assets, in mountain terrain. Once committed, the army would be trapped between hostile forces and impassable geography. These were not weak objections. They were correct. What allowed the plan to proceed was not confidence in execution, but confidence in assumptions. The first assumption was psychological. Rome would not believe the Alps were a viable invasion route until it was too late to respond coherently. Surprise would not be tactical. It would be systemic. The second assumption was political. Northern Italian tribes resented Roman domination and would see Hannibal's arrival not as an invasion, but as an opportunity. Their support would compensate for losses incurred during the crossing. The third assumption was temporal. Hannibal believed that speed mattered more than strength. A diminished army arriving early could force Rome into choices a larger army arriving late could not. Each assumption carried hidden risk. If any one failed, the strategy unraveled. This was not a plan designed to adapt. It was a plan designed to force. It forced Rome to react. It forced allies to choose sides. It forced Hannibal's own army into a point of no return. And this reveals the true nature of the decision. The Alpine crossing was not about geography. It was about commitment. By choosing the one path that made retreat impossible, Hannibal removed hesitation from his own system. There would be no fallback debate. No recalculation mid-campaign. The army would move forward because it could not move back. This is a form of strategic self-binding rarely discussed. By eliminating alternatives, Hannibal simplified his own command problem at the cost of catastrophic risk. The question is not whether this was brave. The question is whether it was rational. Because once the decision was made, the strategy left the realm of planning and entered the domain where logistics, terrain, and chance could destroy everything before Rome even understood what was happening. And that is where the campaign truly begins. Once the decision was made, there was no such thing as a clean execution. There was only controlled deterioration. The Alpine crossing transformed Hannibal's army from an organized fighting force into a system under constant stress. Every element that doctrine treats as foundational began to erode simultaneously: supply, cohesion, morale, and command clarity. This was not a march. It was a prolonged exposure to failure. Logistics broke first. Mountain routes were not roads. They were narrow paths shaped by weather and tribal movement, not by armies. Pack animals slipped and fell. Supplies were lost not through enemy action, but through gravity. Food consumption spiked as cold increased metabolic demand, while resupply dropped to near zero. Hannibal was not managing logistics. He was rationing collapse. The elephants illustrate this problem with brutal clarity. They were psychological weapons and symbols of power on open ground. In the Alps, they became logistical anchors. They required food that could not be foraged easily, moved slowly on ice, and attracted enemy attention. Yet abandoning them would have been a signal of weakness before the campaign even began. Hannibal chose to carry the burden forward, accepting losses later in exchange for immediate morale preservation. Morale itself became a fragile variable. Soldiers were not just exhausted. They were disoriented. The environment offered no familiar reference points. There was no visible enemy to fight, only terrain that punished every mistake. Command authority in such conditions is not enforced by rank. It is enforced by belief. Hannibal had to maintain the perception that suffering had purpose, that the end justified the loss. Once that belief fractured, the army would fragment. This is where the first microcrisis emerged. At one point, hostile tribes ambushed the column in narrow passes, forcing Hannibal to fight defensive actions in terrain that nullified his advantages. Casualties mounted. Progress slowed. The army risked stalling entirely. A stalled army in the Alps does not recover. It dies. Hannibal's response was not tactical brilliance. It was prioritization. He accepted losses to maintain movement. Wounded soldiers were left behind. Equipment was abandoned. Cohesion was sacrificed to momentum. This is the opposite of doctrinal wisdom. But in this environment, stopping to preserve strength would have destroyed the force completely. The second crisis was temporal. Snowfall began earlier than expected. Visibility dropped. Paths vanished. This was the moment where chance, not planning, threatened to end the campaign. No reserve plan existed for a prolonged halt. Hannibal's only option was to push forward faster, despite rising casualties. Risk was not mitigated. It was concentrated. By the time the army descended into northern Italy, it was no longer the force that had left Spain. Estimates vary, but losses were severe. What remained was hardened, desperate, and irrevocably committed. And yet, from a strategic perspective, something remarkable had occurred. Rome had not intervened. Roman forces had not met Hannibal in the mountains. Roman command had not mobilized to block the crossing. The absence of Roman action was not oversight. It was disbelief. The system had filtered the signal out as noise. Hannibal arrived with fewer men, but with something more valuable. He arrived with initiative. But initiative only matters if the enemy responds poorly. The next phase of the campaign would reveal whether Rome's decision-making structure could adapt to a reality it had never planned for. The first Roman responses were fragmented, hesitant, and shaped by assumptions that no longer applied. Reports of an enemy army emerging from the Alps arrived with contradictions. The numbers did not make sense. The route defied logic. Roman commanders understood the words, but not the implication. This is where institutional inertia begins to matter more than individual intelligence. Roman command culture relied on precedent. There was no precedent for this. An enemy army arriving from the north with elephants was not simply unexpected. It fell outside the category of credible threats. That delay in classification bought Hannibal time, and time was the only resource he still possessed. Rome's first mistake was interpretive. They assumed exhaustion meant weakness. They assumed losses meant desperation. They assumed an army that had suffered that much could not immediately fight on its own terms. These assumptions were rational. And they were wrong. Roman commanders attempted containment rather than annihilation. They moved to block Hannibal's movement, protect allied cities, and shadow his advance. What they avoided was committing to a single decisive response. This hesitation created exactly the operational space Hannibal needed. The second mistake was doctrinal rigidity. Roman forces sought battle where doctrine said they should fight, not where Hannibal forced them to fight. Hannibal repeatedly chose terrain that amplified asymmetry, rivers, narrow valleys, fog, and constrained maneuver space. These were not accidental choices. They were deliberate attempts to collapse Roman formation discipline. At Trebia, Roman forces were drawn into battle under conditions that negated their numerical advantage. At Lake Trasimene, they were ambushed in terrain that made retreat impossible. Each engagement reinforced Roman confidence that victory could be achieved by decisive confrontation, even as evidence suggested otherwise. This produced a dangerous feedback loop. Defeat increased pressure to restore honor. Pressure accelerated decision-making. Accelerated decisions relied even more heavily on doctrine. By the time Rome assembled the largest army it had ever fielded to face Hannibal at Cannae, the strategic die was already cast. Rome was no longer choosing how to fight. It was reacting to humiliation. From Hannibal's perspective, this was the payoff. The Alpine crossing had not defeated Rome. It had destabilized Rome's judgment. Hannibal forced Rome into a binary mindset: win decisively now, or lose control of Italy. That framing eliminated patience. It eliminated caution. It eliminated adaptability. Yet even here, the strategy carried an unspoken risk. Every Roman defeat made Rome more desperate, but also more determined. Rome could afford to lose armies. Hannibal could not afford to lose momentum. The deeper the psychological wound, the greater the political backlash inside Rome. The question was no longer whether Hannibal could defeat Roman armies. The question was whether he could convert Roman errors into irreversible strategic collapse. That conversion would require something he did not fully control. The immediate outcomes were undeniable. Roman armies were destroyed. Commanders were killed. Entire legions vanished from the order of battle. Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and Cannae were not tactical victories. They were systemic shocks. Rome lost confidence in its commanders, its formations, and its assumptions about how wars on Italian soil were supposed to unfold. But outcomes are not endpoints. They are transitions. After Cannae, Rome did not collapse. It recalibrated. The political cost inside Rome was severe. Panic rippled through the city. Emergency measures were enacted. Rituals were performed to stabilize public morale. Yet beneath the fear, something harder formed. Rome stopped trying to win quickly. It stopped chasing decisive battle. It abandoned the very reactions Hannibal had engineered. This was the strategic pivot Hannibal could not prevent. Rome adopted avoidance. Delay. Attrition by denial rather than engagement. The Fabian approach did not defeat Hannibal on the battlefield. It defeated his timeline. Here the hidden costs of the Alpine strategy become unavoidable. Hannibal had won battles at a scale that should have ended wars, but he lacked the tools to convert victory into surrender. His army was too small to besiege Rome. His supply base was too fragile to sustain prolonged operations. His alliances were conditional, not binding. Italian defections occurred, but not at the scale required to break Rome's system. The human cost inside Hannibal's army compounded silently. Veterans hardened by the crossing and early victories were irreplaceable. Casualties could not be replenished at the same rate Rome replenished its legions. Every skirmish, every winter, every failed political gamble reduced the campaign's remaining margin. There was also a psychological cost rarely discussed. Hannibal had committed himself to a strategy that eliminated retreat. Once Rome adapted, Hannibal was trapped inside his own success. To withdraw would concede defeat. To advance without resources was impossible. He remained in Italy for years, winning tactically, losing strategically, watching initiative bleed away one decision at a time. This is the darkest paradox of the campaign. The Alpine crossing worked too well. It forced Rome to change. And once Rome changed, the strategy that depended on Roman rigidity lost its leverage. If Hannibal had failed early, the campaign would be remembered as folly. Because he succeeded, it became something more unsettling, a demonstration that even perfect execution of an unorthodox strategy cannot guarantee strategic closure. Which brings us to the final question. What, exactly, does this campaign teach us about strategy itself? This campaign is often framed as a lesson in audacity. That interpretation is comforting. And incomplete. Hannibal's Alpine crossing was not about courage, endurance, or even surprise in the narrow sense. It was about exploiting the limits of how a system thinks under stress. Rome did not lose because it lacked strength. It lost because it initially interpreted an impossible event as an improbable one, and delayed adapting accordingly. The deeper strategic lesson is this: unorthodox strategies do not win by being clever. They win by forcing the enemy to misclassify reality. Hannibal attacked Rome's decision filters. He introduced an input that the system was not designed to process. For a brief period, Rome responded with confusion, partial measures, and doctrinal reflexes. That window was decisive. But this also reveals the built-in fragility of such strategies. They depend on static enemies. They depend on assumptions remaining unchallenged. They depend on time pressure favoring the disruptor. Once Rome changed its behavior, the strategy lost its edge. Not because it was flawed, but because its success conditions were temporary by nature. This leads to a second, less discussed principle. By eliminating retreat and alternatives, Hannibal simplified his command problem at the cost of strategic elasticity. Commitment created clarity. It also created entrapment. When the environment changed, the strategy could not. There is no version of this campaign where Hannibal's plan transitions cleanly into a stable end state without resources Carthage could not provide. The Alpine crossing solved the problem of entry. It did not solve the problem of termination. So what should we take from this? First, unorthodox strategies are tools for forcing engagement, not for sustaining dominance. Second, shock is perishable. It must be converted quickly or it decays into irrelevance. Third, the greatest risk of breaking doctrine is not failure. It is success that locks you into a path you cannot exit. Hannibal did not lose because he crossed the Alps. He lost because no one, including Hannibal, fully understood what victory would look like after the shock wore off. And that may be the most uncomfortable lesson of all. History remembers Hannibal as the men who crossed the Alps. Strategy remembers him as the men who exposed the limits of winning without an end state. Rome learned to survive defeat. Hannibal never learned how to stop winning battles that no longer mattered. The Alps were not the campaign's climax. They were its point of no return. The next time an army chooses the impossible path, the real question will not be whether it can succeed. It will be whether success leaves any room to stop. If this campaign unsettles you, it should. Because the most dangerous strategies are not the ones that fail loudly, but the ones that work just long enough to trap everyone involved.